Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Tuesday everybody. Let's begin with some positive news before moving to more concerning developments. According to China's chief mission to Mars designer, Liu Jizhong, speaking at a deep space exploration event, China's groundbreaking mission to bring samples from Mars to Earth could begin as early as 2028, advancing the timeline by 2 years. The Tianwen-3 mission plans to conduct 2 launches around that time to retrieve Martian samples. This accelerated schedule is more ambitious than the 2030 target previously announced, although the timeline has shifted in recent years. The 2028 target aligns with the plan proposed in 2022 by a senior scientist involved with the Tianwen, which means Questions to Heaven, program, which aims to return samples to Earth by 2031. These developments follow China's historic achievement of collecting the first samples from the far side of the Moon in June, a development we covered at the time. Achieving the first successful return of samples from Mars would be a major milestone for China's space program, fulfilling General Secretary Xi Jinping's vision of establishing China as a leading space power. A key goal of the Tianwen-3 mission is to search for signs of life on Mars. According to state media, the mission will also attempt technical innovations in surface sampling, takeoff and ascent from Mars, and a spacecraft rendezvous in Martian orbit. The Tianwen mission series first succeeded in 2021 when the Tianwen-1 probe reached Mars and deployed the Zhurong rover. Zhurong's landing made China the third nation after the Soviet Union and the United States to land on Mars. The US first landed on Mars in 1976 with the Viking 1. Its last landing was in 2021, which is currently collecting samples for a future return to Earth. Following Liu's speech, SpaceX chief executive Elon Musk said in an X post that his company's first uncrewed starships will be launched in 2026 when the next window opens. Quote, "These will be uncrewed to test the reliability of landing intact on Mars. If those landings go well, then the first crewed flights to Mars will be in 4 years." End quote. He added that the flight rate will grow exponentially from there, with the goal of building a self-sustaining city in about 20 years. Quote, "Being multi-planetary will vastly increase the probable lifespan of consciousness, as we will no longer have all our eggs, literally and metaphorically, on one planet. It currently costs about $1 billion per ton of useful payload to the surface of Mars. That needs to be improved to $100,000 per ton to build a self-sustaining city there. So the technology needs to be 10,000 times better. Extremely difficult, but not impossible." End quote. Next up, yesterday US-based The Wall Street Journal published a piece arguing that while China asserts a more muscular influence on global affairs, Western experts face growing constraints in their efforts to study the emerging power. The outlet writes that a relentless tightening of political controls, quote, "has curtailed access to even routine information and throttled research into topics that were once open. Interactions between people in China and foreigners are subject to intensifying state surveillance, stymieing the flow of ideas." End quote. These obstacles have led some China scholars to change their fields of study or reprise research techniques developed during the Mao Zedong era, when the country was largely closed off to the rest of the world. The piece argues, too, that a sharp rise in anti-China sentiment in the US and other Western countries is compounding the difficulties. Money is also getting harder to come by, with new data showing US federal funding for China-focused research falling markedly in recent years. Some academics worry that a decline in China studies will make it more difficult for the US and other democracies to manage relations with one of the world's most consequential nations, while Beijing continues building expertise on open societies in the West. Rory Trey, a politics scholar at Princeton University, reportedly told the outlet, quote, "We just don't have the expertise on China that China has on us." End quote. Concerns over data control and the safety of researchers has been a key issue in US-China negotiations over the renewal of a significant bilateral science and technology agreement, which outlines the terms for academic collaboration. The short-term extension of this agreement expired at the end of last month, but a senior official from the Biden administration stated that discussions between the two countries are ongoing. These discussions include efforts to enhance transparency and ensure reciprocal access to scientific data. If the agreement is allowed to lapse, it could further complicate the work of US-based scholars in China, as they would no longer have the assurance of governmental support in facilitating access. The Wall Street Journal argues that conditions for Western scholars in China have steadily worsened since Xi Jinping took power in 2012, with the situation deteriorating further during the COVID-19 pandemic. China's border closures severely disrupted on-the-ground research by foreign academics, and many Chinese scholars were also unable to travel abroad. Chinese universities exerted control over cross-border discussions on video conferencing platforms. Since China reopened its borders in early 2023, more foreign academics have returned, but some report difficulties at immigration where they are questioned for hours about their research. Others are reluctant to visit due to security concerns for both themselves and the Chinese individuals they interact with, citing recent detentions of foreign nationals on national security grounds and the disappearances of some China-based Japanese scholars. Those who have returned to China often find the research environment more challenging than before. Social scientists and historians, for example, report increased difficulty in conducting in-person interviews, archival research, and other fieldwork. A 2022 report by the American Council of Learned Societies, based on interviews with over a dozen North American China scholars, find that many had shifted their research focus due to the obstacles they encountered. Running academic surveys in China has also become more difficult, the outlet reports. Political sensitivities have made local survey firms less willing to work with foreign clients, with costs skyrocketing to the point that some researchers are priced out of the market. Support for Chinese studies in the US has also waned. The number of China-related research projects funded by the US National Science Foundation, NSF, has dropped by more than half between 2012 and 2017 and 2018 and 2023, with the steepest declines in social and economic sciences, according to a forthcoming working paper by Princeton researchers. NSF grants for field research in China have nearly vanished, falling by almost 75% over the same period. It is unclear, the Wall Street Journal writes, if this decline reflects a reluctance to fund China-focused research or if scholars are simply avoiding China-related projects due to fear or inconvenience. For students aspiring to government careers, spending time in China can negatively impact their ability to obtain security clearances, according to Andrew Murtha, director of the China Studies program at Johns Hopkins University. Some researchers are adapting by focusing on historical periods before communist rule, or by using older research methods like textual analysis of party documents and state media. Others are turning to modern technologies such as satellite imagery and remote sensing data due to the sensitivity of their research topics. While some scholars can still do fieldwork in China by avoiding sensitive topics and leveraging long-standing local relationships, the outlook is bleaker for junior scholars and doctoral students who lack experience and funding. The sharp decline in the number of American students in China during the pandemic and the slow recovery post-COVID raise concerns about the future pipeline of China experts. Michael Shoney, a Harvard historian who recently returned to China after nearly 4 years, expressed to the outlet, quote, "We don't know whether in 10 years China will be America's enemy, competitor, or perhaps even a friend. Under any of these scenarios, do we really think it's better to know less about China rather than more?" End quote. I think most viewers of this channel will agree that it is best that we know more. And stories like this just further reinforces my commitment to producing these episodes on China, despite the risks associated with doing that here. And I hope to continue doing so in the future. Thank you very much everyone who has supported me in these efforts to allow the channel to continue growing. Next up we move to the Chinese economy, but just quickly, if you are getting value from today's episode in particular, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing and subscribing are the primary ways in which the channel can grow and be shown to new people. Hopefully can make a difference, however modest, in helping the world better understand this country, especially as so many analysts and scholars have been chased out. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. Next up, and finally for today, we move to the Chinese economy. Yesterday, we briefly discussed the new CPI data for August, which showed that CPI was up 0.4% versus up 0.5% in July. At first glance, this might seem a good sign that domestic demand is rising, but in fact, most of the price increase can be explained by food shortages driving food prices up. The consensus is that China is still in a deflationary phase. In a sign price pressures are becoming even more subdued, China's core inflation, which strips out volatile items such as food and energy, cooled in August to the weakest in more than 3 years. The last few days have seen a chorus of analysts and commentators expressing concern that China's long, stubborn deflation is now entering a new, more dangerous stage, raising calls for immediate policy action. According to a report published today by Bloomberg Economics, a broader measure of the economy-wide prices known as the Gross Domestic Product deflator will likely extend its current 5-quarter drop into 2025. That would amount to China's longest streak of deflation ever on record. Robert Xing, chief China economist at Morgan Stanley, in a note yesterday observed, quote, "We are definitely in deflation and probably going through the second stage of deflation. Experience from Japan suggests that the longer deflation drags on, the more stimulus China will eventually need to break the debt deflation challenge." End quote. The risk for China is that deflation could spiral, as households facing shrinking incomes might reduce their spending or postpone purchases in anticipation of further price drops. This would hurt corporate revenues, dampen investment, and trigger more salary cuts and layoffs, potentially leading to bankruptcies among families and businesses. While Chinese officials have sought to stifle discussion about deflation, warning analysts to avoid using the term, it's beginning to enter public debate. As regular viewers know, over the weekend, former People's Bank of China Governor Yi Gang said his nation should focus on fighting deflation, in a rare admission by a prominent figure in China that falling prices are threatening the country's growth outlook. Expectations for deflation are spilling into markets too, stoking a bond rally that's sent yields to record lows and stoked official concerns that banks have become too exposed to interest rate risks. We have covered this in recent weeks. Fred Newman, chief Asia economist at HSBC, said on the CPI data yesterday, quote, "There is still a need for more demand-side policy measures to raise price pressures to absorb excess capacity in the economy." End quote. This raises the question then, why is it so hard for China to boost domestic demand? Well, to end today's video, we will examine a recent piece by Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis by that very title, which argues that Beijing's unwillingness to boost the consumption share of GDP is not as bizarre as it seems. We now quote selected excerpts from the piece directly. As most analysts expected, the Chinese Communist Party's third plenum communiqué released July 18th was more vague on demand-side measures designed to boost the role of consumption in driving the Chinese economy than it was on the supply-side measures. This was the case even though over the past 5 to 10 years, a near-unanimous consensus has developed among both Chinese and foreign economists that consumption's very weak role in driving the economy is the main constraint to sustainable growth in China. Globally, according to the World Bank, consumption accounts for roughly 75% of gross domestic product, while the remaining 25% driven by investment. In China, however, consumption accounts for 53 to 54% of GDP, while investment accounts for an astonishing 42 to 43% of GDP. The rest is accounted for by China's trade surplus. Despite this consensus, Beijing has been unable to shift the economy away from its over-reliance on investment, and more recently on its trade surplus, to maintain high growth rates. In early June, American economist Paul Krugman publicly warned in a Bloomberg interview that China's leaders were bizarrely unwilling to use more government spending to support consumer demand instead of production. But Beijing's reluctance to support consumer demand might not be as bizarre as it seems. Other countries in similar positions, most famously Japan in the 1980s, also said they wanted to boost consumption shares of their economies but struggled to do so. Raising the consumption share of the economy is much more difficult than it may at first seem. This is probably because a low consumption share is not a feature of the economy that is separate from its overall functioning. It is fundamental to the way the economy works, and resolving it requires structural supply-side changes that are very difficult to manage. In China's case, since the early 1990s, growth has been underpinned by a series of transfers. These transfers have subsidized investment in manufacturing, infrastructure, and the property sector, in part by ensuring high and rising savings rates, but almost always at the expense of Chinese households. These transfers included the following: a strictly managed credit system that ensured Chinese savings, which by the early 2000s had reached the highest share of GDP ever recorded, were mostly directed by government-controlled banks into investments into sectors targeted by Beijing, including transportation and logistical infrastructure, a very efficient communication system, manufacturing plants and equipment, and technology research. Repressed interest rates with highly negative real rates for much of the 2000s, and repressed risk-adjusted credit spreads. These represented a transfer of resources from net savers to net borrowers. China's hukou system for household registration, which limited the ability of workers to obtain social benefits and limited their legal rights in disputes with employers. Eminent domain and environmental degradation, which pushed a portion of development costs onto the household sector. Inefficient investment that effectively transferred resources from households to businesses. China's massive investment in transportation and logistical infrastructure was positive for the overall economy in the decades when the Chinese economy was severely underinvested relative to investment it could productively absorb. Beginning in the late 2000s and early 2010s, however, it became evident that an increasing share of this investment was generating negative value creation for the economy. This is when local government debt began to soar relative to GDP, even though most of the debt was directed into investment. These transfers, sometimes amounting to as much as 4 to 5 percentage points of GDP per year in the 2000s, meant that for decades household income could not keep pace with GDP growth. However, when GDP surged at annual rates of 10 to 11% in the period through the early 2010s, Chinese households barely noticed the impact because their incomes were also surging. Although this occurred at a much lower rate thanks to the transfers, it was still extremely high, 7 to 8% annually. Pressure to close the gap between GDP growth and household income growth only rose more recently as GDP growth rates, especially nominal GDP growth rates, sharply dropped. These and other direct and implicit transfers meant that China's global competitiveness in manufacturing was the other side of the coin of China's very weak consumption. Thanks to these direct and implicit transfers, in other words, China's extremely competitive manufacturing and the world's best transportation and logistical infrastructure should not be thought of as separate from the country's extraordinarily low domestic consumption. The former exists because of the latter, and one requires the other. That is why it is so difficult to boost the role consumption plays in the economy. There are basically two ways China can do it. One way is in the form of fiscal stimulus directed at the demand side of the economy. Beijing can borrow anywhere between 1 to 3 trillion RMB and directly and indirectly distribute the proceeds to households in ways that boost consumption. Besides the fact that Zhongnanhai find this to be ideologically problematic, the problem is that this would be a one-off boost and could only be achieved with increased debt. As Beijing wants to rein in an extraordinary surge in debt that has left China with among the most indebted balance sheets in the world, this is not a sustainable solution. The other way, the sustainable way, is to gradually reverse the transfers so that household income begins to grow sustainably faster than overall GDP. Here the problem is that an increase in the household share implies a reduction in the share of other sectors, the business sector, local governments, or Beijing. It is the transfers to these sectors that create the constraint. After 3 decades when Chinese manufacturers' global competitiveness was effectively built on transfers in one direction, what would happen to the manufacturing prowess if these transfers were reversed? Their prowess would almost certainly decline, as they would struggle to manage in a significantly less friendly supply-side environment. One likely result could be a short-term contraction, as Chinese manufacturers learn to live without the implicit supply-side support and essentially return to various subsidies. Because one of the consequences of these transfers has been a disproportionately large manufacturing share of the economy, 27 to 28% of China's GDP compared to 15 to 16% of global GDP. Anything that undermines China's manufacturing competitiveness in the short term is likely to be especially painful for the economy. This is why Beijing's unwillingness to boost the consumption share of GDP is not as bizarre as it seems. Raising the consumption share in a sustainable way, as was the case in Japan in the 1990s, implicitly means reversing what has made Chinese manufacturing so globally competitive. The long-term benefits of rebalancing the economy could be overwhelmed by the adverse short-term consequences to China's large manufacturing share and its important infrastructure investment. It is one thing to say, as most analysts inside and outside China now agree, that households should gain additional resources. It is quite another thing to decide how the cost of their gain is to be allocated. If the goal is to avoid any short-term pain, the process is likely to be extremely slow, as was the case with Japan. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Tuesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.